On the surface, he was the last person anyone would suspect. Handsome, intelligent, charismatic, a college student with political ambitions. The kind of man parents wanted their daughters to date. But beneath that carefully crafted image lurked something far darker. A predator responsible for some of the most horrifying crimes in American history. For years, he moved through society unnoticed. He volunteered for political campaigns, worked at crisis hotlines, attended law school, all while secretly hunting his victims. When the truth finally emerged, it shocked the nation, because Ted Bundy didn't look like a monster, and that's exactly what made him so dangerous. This is the story of how one of America's most infamous serial killers fooled an entire country, and how his reign of terror left dozens of families shattered forever. Before the murders, before the manhunt, before his name became synonymous with evil. There was simply Ted. Born in Vermont in 1946, Ted Bundy's life began with uncertainty. For much of his childhood, he believed his grandparents were actually his parents, and that his mother was his older sister. The truth surrounding his birth remained hidden. Years later, psychologists and investigators would debate whether those early experiences played any role in the darkness that followed. But one thing was clear: Ted Bundy learned early how to hide things. Friends later described him as intelligent and capable, yet many also sensed something strange beneath the surface. A loneliness, an isolation, a need to reinvent himself. As he grew older, Bundy became obsessed with appearance. How people saw him, how they perceived him, and perhaps most importantly, how easily he could manipulate them. No one around him could have imagined where those talents would eventually lead. By the early 1970s, Ted Bundy seemed to be building an impressive future. He attended college, became involved in politics, volunteered in community organizations, even worked on a suicide hotline. Ironically, one of the people who worked alongside him there was future true crime author Ann Rule. Rule later described Bundy as intelligent, articulate, and compassionate. The kind of person you'd trust, the kind of person you'd call a friend. That's what made the revelations years later so difficult to comprehend. Because while Bundy was presenting himself as a promising young professional, young women were disappearing, and nobody connected the dots, at least not yet. In January 1974, an 18-year-old student named Joni Lenz was brutally attacked in her apartment near the University of Washington. She survived, barely. The assault was shocking, but investigators had little evidence. No suspect. No clear motive. Then, months later, more young women began disappearing, one after another. College students, young professionals, women with bright futures ahead of them. Many vanished in broad daylight, without witnesses, without obvious suspects, without a trace. Families waited for phone calls that never came. Friends searched desperately for answers. Police departments worked separate investigations. No one realized a serial predator might be responsible. And while investigators searched for clues, Ted Bundy was quietly perfecting his methods. What made Bundy different from many criminals was his ability to weaponize trust. He didn't usually force his way into victims' lives. He invited them in. Witnesses later described a handsome young man approaching women in public places. Sometimes his arm appeared injured. Other times he used crutches. He'd ask for help loading something into his vehicle, moving books, carrying items. Simple requests. The kind most people wouldn't think twice about. And that's what made his strategy so effective. The victims weren't meeting a frightening stranger. They were helping someone who appeared vulnerable. Someone who seemed harmless. Someone who looked normal. That illusion would prove deadly. July 14, 1974. A warm summer day at Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington. Hundreds of people filled the beach. Families relaxed in the sun. Children played in the water. Teenagers gathered with friends. Among the crowd moved a young man wearing a sling. Witnesses later recalled him introducing himself as Ted. He approached multiple women throughout the day, politely asking for assistance. Most declined. Two did not. One was 23-year-old Janice Ott. The other was 19-year-old Denise Nasland. Both disappeared. Neither returned home. The shocking part wasn't just that they vanished, it was where they vanished. A crowded public park, in broad daylight, surrounded by hundreds of people. For investigators, this represented a terrifying escalation. Whoever was responsible wasn't acting out of panic or opportunity. He was confident, organized, and growing bolder. For months, investigators struggled. Then an unusual clue emerged. Multiple witnesses remembered something. The same name. Ted. A composite sketch was created. Thousands of tips poured in. And among those tips came a surprising name. Ted Bundy. People who knew him saw the sketch and noticed similarities. His girlfriend even contacted authorities. Friends raised concerns. Yet investigators hesitated. Bundy didn't fit their expectations. He was educated, well-spoken, successful. No criminal record matching what they imagined. Surely they had the wrong man. That hesitation would allow Bundy to continue his killing spree. And soon, the violence would spread beyond Washington. Far beyond. As investigators chased leads in Washington, disappearances began occurring elsewhere. Oregon, Utah, Colorado. Young women vanished under eerily similar circumstances. Different states, different jurisdictions, different investigators. At the time, police agencies rarely shared information efficiently across state lines. The pattern remained fragmented. To one department, it appeared to be a local disappearance. To another, an isolated tragedy. But viewed together, something terrifying was emerging. A predator was moving across the American West, and he was becoming increasingly confident that he could get away with it. For years he did, but every killer eventually makes mistakes, and Ted Bundy's first major mistake was approaching. By late 1974, investigators across multiple states were beginning to notice something unsettling. The disappearances weren't random. The victims shared similarities. Most were young women. Many had dark hair parted down the middle. Several vanished from college campuses or public places. Witnesses repeatedly described a charming man. A man who often appeared injured. A man who sometimes drove a tan Volkswagen Beetle. But there was a problem. America had millions of Volkswagens, and the suspect's description was frustratingly ordinary. Average height. Good-looking, well-dressed. Nothing that immediately stood out. The killer was hiding in plain sight, and while detectives struggled to connect cases across state lines, Bundy continued moving. Continued hunting, continued killing. The body count was growing, and nobody knew exactly how high it already was. In the fall of 1974, Bundy relocated to Utah. To friends and classmates, the move seemed perfectly normal. He enrolled in law school, continued pursuing a respectable future, maintained the image of an ambitious young professional. But behind that carefully crafted facade, investigators believe the murders continued. Women disappeared in Utah under circumstances eerily similar to those in Washington. The fear was spreading. College campuses began warning students. Young women became more cautious. Parents worried. News reports increased. Yet Bundy somehow managed to avoid suspicion. The same qualities that helped him lure victims also helped him evade detection. He was calm, articulate, confident. He knew exactly how to appear trustworthy. And perhaps most chillingly, he enjoyed the deception. Then something happened that nearly changed everything. One woman survived. In November 1974, 18-year-old Carol Duranch encountered a man who identified himself as a police officer. He claimed someone had attempted to break into her vehicle. He seemed professional, helpful, concerned. At first, she believed him. After all, why wouldn't she? He appeared legitimate. But once she entered his vehicle, something felt wrong. Very wrong. The man became increasingly nervous. His story stopped making sense. Then suddenly he attempted to handcuff her. Panic exploded. Carol fought desperately, punching, kicking, screaming, refusing to surrender. Against incredible odds, she escaped, running for her life. For the first time, someone had survived an encounter with Ted Bundy and could tell police exactly what happened. Her testimony would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Because now investigators weren't just looking for a killer. They had a witness. And that witness remembered his face. As months passed, investigators collected more information, more witness statements, more vehicle descriptions, more similarities between cases. The pieces were finally beginning to fit together, and increasingly, one name kept appearing. Ted Bundy. His girlfriend had already expressed concerns. Friends had noticed similarities to the composite sketches. Even some investigators privately wondered if they had found their man, but proving it would be another challenge entirely. Circumstantial evidence wasn't enough. They needed something concrete, something undeniable, something that could place Bundy directly at the center of the crimes. That breakthrough was coming, and it would arrive during an ordinary traffic stop. August 16th, 1975. Just after midnight, a police officer in Utah noticed a suspicious vehicle. The car was moving strangely. The driver seemed nervous. The officer decided to pull him over. Behind the wheel sat Ted Bundy. At first, the stop appeared routine, but when officers searched the vehicle, they discovered something alarming. Handcuffs, a ski mask, a crowbar, rope. Items that immediately raised suspicion. Bundy attempted to explain them away, but investigators weren't convinced. The discovery triggered a deeper investigation, and the closer they looked, the worse things became. Suddenly, Bundy wasn't just a promising law student, he was becoming the prime suspect in multiple crimes. The mask was slipping, and the world was finally beginning to see what lurked beneath. Following his arrest, investigators arranged a lineup. Among those asked to identify him was Carol Durange, the survivor, the woman who had escaped, the woman who had stared directly into her attacker's face. When she saw Bundy, she didn't hesitate. She identified him. For investigators, it was a huge breakthrough. Finally, they had a victim who could place him at the scene of a crime. Bundy was charged with aggravated kidnapping. Yet even now, many people struggled to believe it. The accused man didn't match their image of a monster. He looked too normal, too polished, too intelligent. But appearances can be deceiving, and nowhere was that lesson clearer than in the courtroom. During the trial, Bundy remained calm, confident, almost relaxed. Observers noted his charm, his composure, his ability to command attention. Even in court, he seemed determined to control the narrative. But the evidence was mounting. Witness testimony, vehicle matches, identification by survivors. Investigators had spent months building their case, and eventually the jury reached its decision. Guilty. For the first time, Ted Bundy was convicted of a serious felony. The sentence wasn't life in prison. It wasn't a murder conviction. But it represented something important. He was finally behind bars. At least that's what everyone thought. Because what happened next would transform the case from a murder investigation into one of the most unbelievable criminal manhunts in American history. Most convicted criminals accept their circumstances. Ted Bundy wasn't most criminals. Even from behind bars, he remained convinced he could outsmart everyone around him. Investigators, judges, prison guards, journalists. He believed he was smarter than all of them. And in some ways, that confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. Because while authorities focused on building murder cases against him, Bundy was developing a plan so audacious that many people would later struggle to believe it actually happened. A prison escape, not once but twice. And the second escape would unleash one of the deadliest chapters of his entire killing spree. The worst was still ahead. Far worse. And soon, an entire nation would be searching for a killer who had vanished once again. By 1977, Ted Bundy was no longer just a suspect. He was facing murder charges. Investigators from multiple states were working to connect him to a growing list of victims. The walls were closing in. For most prisoners, this would have been the beginning of the end. For Ted Bundy, it was merely another challenge. He was transferred to Colorado to stand trial for murder. Even behind bars, Bundy remained remarkably confident. He spent hours studying legal books, represented himself in court proceedings, and carefully observed every weakness in the system around him. Then, on June 7, 1977, he made his move. Bundy was inside a courthouse library conducting legal research. Because he was acting as his own attorney, he was granted a level of freedom many inmates never received. At one point, guards left him alone. That was all he needed. Without warning, Bundy ran toward an open window, then jumped 2 stories, straight to the ground below. For a moment, nobody could believe what had happened. The accused serial killer had literally leaped out of a courthouse and escaped. News spread rapidly. Authorities launched a massive manhunt. Helicopters searched forests. Officers combed mountain trails. The public was warned. Ted Bundy was on the loose. Again. For nearly a week, Bundy survived in the rugged wilderness surrounding Aspen, Colorado. He stole food, avoided search teams, moved constantly. The mountains became his hiding place. Residents locked their doors. Parents kept children close. Nobody knew where he would appear next. Despite his confidence, however, Bundy wasn't prepared for life as a fugitive. He was exhausted, hungry, and increasingly desperate. 6 days after his escape, authorities finally found him. He was arrested and returned to jail. For many people, the nightmare seemed over. Surely officials would never allow him another opportunity. Surely security would be tightened. Surely he would never escape again. They were wrong. What happened next remains one of the most astonishing prison escapes in American history. While incarcerated in Colorado, Bundy began preparing. Quietly, patiently, methodically. He exercised constantly, lost weight intentionally, studied the jail's layout, measured gaps, observed guard schedules. Every day he gathered information. Every day he refined his plan. Then, on the night of December 30th, 1977, he disappeared. Bundy had cut a hole in the ceiling of his cell. The opening was incredibly small. Only by losing significant weight had he managed to squeeze through. After crawling into the space above the jail, he navigated through the building unnoticed. Then he entered the apartment of the jailer. The apartment was empty. Bundy changed clothes, walked out the front door, and vanished. No alarms, no dramatic chase, no confrontation. One of America's most wanted killers simply walked away. Authorities wouldn't discover the escape for hours. By then, Ted Bundy was gone. And this time, he wasn't heading for the mountains. He was heading towards something far more dangerous. Bundy traveled across the country using stolen vehicles, buses, and false identities. State after state slipped behind him. Colorado, Illinois, Georgia, Florida. As investigators scrambled to track his movements, Bundy remained one step ahead. News reports described him as armed and dangerous. Police agencies coordinated searches. Wanted posters appeared nationwide. Yet somehow he kept moving, kept hiding, kept planning. The farther he traveled, the more desperate he became. His money was running out. His options were shrinking. And investigators believe his violent urges were intensifying. By January 1978, Bundy had arrived in Tallahassee, Florida. Few people there knew his face. Few recognized the danger. And within days, tragedy would strike. January 15th, 1978. Just after 3 a.m., most students at Florida State University were asleep. Inside the Chi Omega sorority house, young women rested after a night of social events. The building was quiet, peaceful, normal. Then Ted Bundy entered. What happened next would become one of the most shocking attacks in American criminal history. Within minutes, Bundy assaulted multiple women inside the house. 2 young women, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, were killed. Others survived severe injuries. The attack was swift, brutal, and terrifying. What made it even more disturbing was how quickly it happened. Investigators later estimated the entire assault lasted only minutes. Then Bundy left, but he wasn't finished, not even close. After leaving the sorority house, Bundy continued through the neighborhood. Just blocks away, he entered another residence. Inside lived 21-year-old Cheryl Thomas. She was asleep when Bundy attacked. Unlike some of his previous victims, Cheryl survived. Though severely injured, she would later provide crucial information. By sunrise, Tallahassee was in shock. News spread rapidly across campus. Students were terrified. Parents called their children. Police flooded the area. The city suddenly realized a predator was among them. What nobody knew at the time was that the attacker wasn't just a local criminal. He was one of the most wanted fugitives in America, and he was still free. For the first time in years, Bundy was making mistakes. Big mistakes. The Florida attacks generated enormous publicity. Witnesses provided descriptions. Investigators collected evidence. The manhunt intensified. Every move Bundy made increased the risk of capture. And yet, he continued. Weeks later, another young victim would disappear. Another devastating crime would occur. But this time, Bundy's luck was running out. The killer who had manipulated victims, fooled investigators, escaped prison twice, and evaded capture across multiple states, was about to make a mistake he couldn't escape. A mistake that would finally bring his reign of terror to an end. For years, Ted Bundy had relied on charm, intelligence, confidence. He believed he was untouchable, smarter than police, smarter than prosecutors, smarter than everyone. But history shows that even the most elusive criminals eventually slip. And in Florida, the cracks were beginning to show. The attacks had become more reckless, more visible, more chaotic. The careful predator who once lured victims with deception was disappearing. In his place was a desperate fugitive losing control. The manhunt was tightening. Investigators were closer than ever before, and soon, a routine police stop would accomplish what years of searching had failed to do. It would finally put Ted Bundy in handcuffs for the last time, and once he was caught, the world would learn just how many lives had been destroyed by the charming stranger nobody suspected. In the early morning hours of February 15, 1978, a police officer in Pensacola, Florida, noticed something unusual. A Volkswagen Beetle. The vehicle was moving suspiciously through a residential neighborhood. The officer decided to investigate. At first, it seemed routine. Another late-night traffic stop. Nothing more. But when the officer approached the vehicle, the driver suddenly accelerated. A chase began. For several minutes, the Volkswagen raced through the streets. The driver desperately tried to escape. Then the vehicle came to a stop. The suspect jumped out and fought fiercely. Punches, kicks, desperation. Anything to avoid being taken into custody. Eventually, officers subdued him, handcuffed him, placed him under arrest. When they asked for identification, the man gave a false name, but authorities quickly discovered who they were dealing with. The suspect wasn't a local criminal. It wasn't a burglar or a car thief. It was Ted Bundy, one of the most wanted fugitives in America. After years of murders, years of investigations, 2 dramatic prison escapes, and a nationwide manhunt, Ted Bundy had finally been captured, and this time, he wasn't getting away. Investigators immediately began examining evidence connected to Bundy. The challenge wasn't proving he was dangerous. The challenge was proving specific crimes. Authorities needed evidence that would stand up in court. Fortunately for prosecutors, Bundy had made mistakes, several mistakes. Witnesses had survived encounters with him. Physical evidence connected him to crimes, and investigators had spent years piecing together a growing mountain of information. One piece of evidence became especially important: a bite mark. During the Chi Omega murders, investigators documented injuries that forensic experts believed matched Bundy's teeth. At the time, bite mark analysis was considered powerful evidence. Combined with witness testimony and other forensic findings, prosecutors believed they finally had what they needed. The killer who had spent years manipulating others was about to face a jury. The courtroom quickly became a media circus. Reporters packed the building. Television cameras followed every development. Journalists from around the world covered the case. For many Americans, this wasn't simply a murder trial. It was the trial of a monster. Yet Ted Bundy didn't behave like most defendants. Instead of appearing broken or frightened, he seemed energized, confident, even charismatic. Many observers were stunned by how normal he appeared, how intelligent he sounded, how composed he remained. The contrast was unsettling, because prosecutors were describing horrific crimes. Yet the man sitting at the defense table looked more like a lawyer than a serial killer. And in a strange twist, Bundy often chose to act as his own attorney. The decision guaranteed one thing: he would remain the center of attention, exactly where he wanted to be. Throughout the trial, Bundy transformed the courtroom into a stage. He questioned witnesses, presented arguments, cross-examined evidence. Sometimes he appeared more interested in performing than defending himself. Observers watched in fascination. Many couldn't believe they were witnessing a murder suspect effectively acting as his own lawyer. But beneath the spectacle, the evidence continued piling up. Witnesses described encounters. Investigators explained findings. Experts connected details. And gradually, the image Bundy had spent years building began to crumble. The charming law student, the aspiring politician, the respectable young professional. Those masks were falling away, and underneath was something much darker, something the jury could no longer ignore. Then came one of the strangest moments in American legal history. During court proceedings, Bundy questioned a witness named Carol Ann Boone. The two had maintained a relationship throughout his legal battles. At one point, Bundy invoked an obscure Florida law. Right there in the courtroom, in front of the judge, the jury, the media, and the nation, he proposed marriage. She accepted. Under Florida law at the time, the declaration was legally valid. The serial killer had effectively gotten married during his own murder trial. The moment generated headlines everywhere. Some viewed it as bizarre. Others saw it as another example of Bundy's obsession with controlling the narrative. No matter what happened, he always wanted attention. And for years, he had been remarkably successful at getting it. But attention couldn't save him from what was coming next. After weeks of testimony, the jury finally reached a decision. The courtroom fell silent. Reporters leaned forward. Families waited anxiously. Then the verdict was announced. Guilty. Ted Bundy was convicted of murder. For the families of the victims, the decision brought a measure of relief. For Bundy, it marked the beginning of the end. But the most memorable moment was still ahead, because when the sentence was handed down, something unexpected happened. The judge spoke directly to Bundy. He acknowledged Bundy's intelligence, his potential, the life he could have lived. Then he delivered a statement that would become famous. The judge expressed sadness that a man with so much ability had chosen such a horrific path. It was a chilling moment, a reminder that evil doesn't always appear obvious. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it looks ordinary. And sometimes it hides in plain sight. Bundy was sentenced to death. Yet even then, the story wasn't over. Years passed, appeals followed, interviews were conducted. Psychologists studied him. Journalists analyzed every detail of his life. Meanwhile, investigators from multiple states continued seeking answers about unsolved disappearances. Many believed Bundy was responsible for far more murders than prosecutors had proven. The official number remained uncertain. Some estimates placed the total far higher than the crimes for which he was convicted. For years, Bundy refused to fully cooperate. He denied, deflected, manipulated, just as he always had. But eventually, time began running out, and with execution approaching, something changed. As his execution date drew closer, Bundy started talking. Investigators flew in from around the country. Each hoped he might reveal information about missing victims, unsolved cases, hidden remains, answers for grieving families. Bundy provided details, confessions, admissions. Some investigators believed he was finally telling the truth. Others suspected he was still manipulating everyone around him, even at the very end. One thing became clear. The scope of his crimes was horrifying. The public had known Bundy was a killer, but many hadn't fully understood the scale, or the cruelty, or the devastation left behind. Every confession brought fresh heartbreak, fresh reminders of lives stolen, families shattered, dreams destroyed. January 24th, 1989, just before dawn. Outside Florida State Prison, thousands gathered. Some carried signs, others celebrated. Many simply wanted to witness history. Inside the prison, Ted Bundy spent his final hours under heavy security. The world watched. News organizations broadcast updates continuously. For years, his crimes had dominated headlines. Now the story was reaching its conclusion. Shortly after 7 a.m., the execution was carried out. The man who had terrorized multiple states, escaped prison twice, and evaded capture for years, was gone. Yet for the families of his victims, closure remained complicated. No execution could undo the pain. No sentence could restore the lives that had been taken. The damage would remain forever. Decades later, Ted Bundy's name remains one of the most infamous in criminal history. Not because he was the deadliest serial killer, not because he was the smartest, but because he shattered assumptions. People expect monsters to look frightening, dangerous, obvious. Bundy taught a terrifying lesson. Sometimes predators are charming, sometimes they are educated, sometimes they are the last people anyone suspects. His crimes changed the way investigators approach serial murder cases. They influenced forensic science, law enforcement cooperation, criminal profiling, and public awareness. But perhaps the most important lesson came from the victims themselves. Because the story should never be about Ted Bundy. It should be about the young women whose futures were stolen, the families who spent years searching for answers, and the survivors whose courage helped bring a killer to justice. For years, Ted Bundy lived a double life. To some, he was intelligent, ambitious, charismatic. To others, he was something far darker, a predator hiding behind a carefully crafted mask. His story remains one of the most chilling examples of how appearances can deceive. Because the truth is this: Ted Bundy didn't look like a monster. And that's exactly why he was able to become one of the most dangerous serial killers in American history. What do you think was the most shocking part of the Ted Bundy case? The prison escapes? The double life? Or the fact that so many people trusted him despite the evidence? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed deep dives into true crime, criminal investigations, and unsolved mysteries, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story.